was WH40K. I need you to remember that, because I can barely remember it myself anymore. The chemicals have eaten through most of my brain's capacity for memory, for identity, for anything that once made me human. But I remember enough. Enough to know what I've become. Enough to understand the eternal joke the Imperium carved into my flesh. Right now, this exact moment as I speak to you, I'm standing 3 kilometers above the poisonous clouds of Hive-Spire on the agri-world of Thessian 4. My skin is peeling off in translucent sheets, falling like blessed snow into the updrafts below. The chemical beacon before me burns with a light so bright it would blind you instantly, but I stopped having human eyes 7 months ago. The mask bolted to my jaw pumps filtered oxygen directly into my collapsed lungs. I am 23 years old. I've been a beacon lighter for 9 months. I will be a beacon lighter until my body finally dissolves completely into the chemical slurry that pools at my feet. But let me tell you how I got here. Let me tell you about the recruitment officer's promises, about the honor of service, about how they told me the Emperor protects those who serve. Let me tell you about every lie that led me to this platform, this poison, this slow and agonizing transformation from human being into human wick. Let me tell you how the Imperium burns its children to light the way for gold. I was born in the lower commercial district of Hive-Spire in a hab block numbered 4471 Gamma. My father, Jorin Kale, worked the textile manufactory on the 800th level, 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, producing the rough spun cloth that would be shipped off-world to become Imperial Guard uniforms. He would come home with his fingers stained permanent gray from the dye vats, smelling of chemical mordants and fatigue. But every night, no matter how exhausted, he would sit with me and my brother Alexei at our small table and share whatever corpse starch rations he'd managed to bring home. I was 19 years old. I had a job as a data clerk in the administrative sectors, punching numbers into cogitators for 8 hours a day, tracking shipment manifests for ore transports. It was mind-numbing work, but it was safe work, clean work, the kind of work that meant you might live to see 40 if you were lucky. I remember the specific details of my life with a clarity that makes their loss more painful. I remember that our HAB unit was 4.2 meters by 3.8 meters. I remember that we had one window, actual transparent glass, that looked out over the smog-choked transit lanes where bulk haulers moved in endless processions. I remember that on my 16th birthday, my father had traded 3 months of saved ration tokens to buy me a book, an actual paper book, not a data slate, containing pre-imperial poetry from old Earth. I couldn't understand most of it, but I loved the weight of it in my hands, the smell of the ancient paper, the idea that words could exist for beauty instead of function. I remember that my brother Alexei wanted to be a medici orderly. He would practice bandaging techniques on me, wrapping my arms in torn fabric scraps, his face serious with concentration. He was 16 and had never seen an actual injury, worse than the production line cuts that were common in the lower hives. I thought his dream was beautiful, naive, but beautiful. I remember these things because they are all that's left of WH40K, the human being. Everything else has been burned away by chemicals that eat through flesh like acid through thin metal. The recruitment notices appeared on the 3rd day of what the Administratum called Economic Reformation Period 7743. which those of us in the lower hives called the month, half the food shipments stopped arriving. They were plastered on every surface. Massive posters printed in bold red and black Gothic script depicting proud workers ascending toward brilliant light. The text promised essential hive services positions, generous ration allocations for worker families, and honor through service to the God Emperor's most vital infrastructure. The recruitment office was located in a converted warehouse on the 900th level, far above where I'd ever been allowed to travel. My father told me not to go. He'd lived through 3 previous reformation periods and knew what imperial recruitment drives really meant. But Alexei had developed a persistent cough, the kind that came from bad air recyclers and poor nutrition, and the medical clinics wanted payment we didn't have. The generous ration allocations would save him. That's what I told myself. I remember the walk to the recruitment center with photographic precision because I've replayed it 10,000 times, trying to identify the exact moment I could have turned back. The transit elevator took 40 minutes to climb from the 800th to the 900th level. I shared it with 60 other workers, all of us pressed together in the chemical-smelling darkness, breathing each other's stale exhalations. Nobody spoke. In the Imperium, speaking to strangers was dangerous. You never knew who might report seditious words to the arbiters. The recruitment center was the cleanest place I'd ever seen. The floors were actual polished rockcrete, not the compressed trash aggregate common in the lower levels. Lumen strips cast steady white light instead of the flickering yellow we lived under. The air was cold and crisp, scrubbed by functional recyclers that actually remove the particulate filth instead of just circulating it. A man in a crisp administratum uniform, not the stained, threadbare kind, but actual pristine cloth with sharp creases, sat behind a desk made of real wood. Real wood. I'd never seen it before except in pic captures. He was perhaps 40 years old, well-fed, with skin that spoke of regular nutrition and clean water. His name was Proctor Vane, according to the identification placard on his desk. Name and citizen designation, he said without looking up from his date slate. Davos Kyle, citizen designation 447-1-Gamma-17839. He input the numbers, and I watched his eyes scan whatever information appeared. Then he looked up at me, and I saw something I couldn't quite identify in his expression. Later I understood it was pity. Age? 19 standard years, sir. Physical condition? Adequate, sir. I've never missed a work shift. Family? Father and younger brother, sir. He made notes on his data slate, then stood and walked around the desk. He was taller than I expected and moved with the confidence of someone who'd never worried about ration shortages or recycler failures or any of the 1,000 small ways the hive killed you slowly. Davos Kyle, he said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice, a gentleness that should have warned me. You've applied for essential services work. Do you understand what that entails? Vital hive infrastructure, sir. The posters said. The posters simplified for mass comprehension. He pulled out a data slate and showed me images. Essential services encompasses multiple critical functions. Based on your medical scan and psychological profile, yes, we scanned you when you entered. You qualify for Class Epsilon work. Specifically, beacon operations at the Hive Apex. The images showed platforms extending from the hive's uppermost reaches, massive chemical braziers burning with brilliant light, and figures in protective gear tending them. The beacon stations guide incoming cargo vessels, Vane explained. Without them, ships cannot navigate through the atmospheric interference to reach the landing platforms. The chemicals required to produce the necessary illumination are intensive. The work requires dedication and tolerance for discomfort. I can handle discomfort, sir. That almost gentle expression again. The compensation is substantial. Your family will receive triple standard rations, priority medical access, and improved HAB unit allocation. The contract is for 5 standard years, with potential for extension or promotion to supervisory positions. 5 years, triple rations, medical access for Alexei's cough. I thought about my brother's bandaging practice, his dream of becoming a decay orderly. I thought about my father's grey-stained fingers and permanent exhaustion. I thought about the book of poetry he'd sacrificed 3 months of food to give me. I'll do it, sir. Vane nodded slowly. He produced a contract, actual paper, stamped with the imperial aquila, and a stylus. Read the terms carefully. I should have. The Emperor knows. Or rather, the Emperor who was just a rotting corpse in a chair on distant Terra, who'd never protected anyone, who was just a symbol the administratum used to make us obedient. I should have read every word, but I was 19 and desperate and stupid with hope. I signed. My hand was steady. Vane took the contract, folded it precisely, and filed it in a drawer. Then he looked at me with that terrible pity again and said, "Report to Transit Station Apex 7 at 0600 tomorrow. Bring nothing. Everything will be provided." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me, boy." The gentleness was gone now, replaced by something flat and hollow. "I'm sending you to hell because the Imperium requires bodies for the fire. But your family will eat. Remember that when you're screaming. Your family will eat." I didn't understand. Not then. The transit to the Hive Apex took 6 hours. 6 hours in a rattling cargo elevator with 11 other recruits, all of us young, all of us wearing the same expression of nervous hope. We were all male. I noticed that even then, though I didn't think much of it. The Imperium had its quotas and requirements, and I'd learned not to question them. One of them introduced himself as Peter, a boy of maybe 18 with the thin frame of someone who'd never quite gotten enough to eat. He kept talking about how his grandfather had served in the Guard, about honor and duty, about how this was their family's chance to prove their loyalty. "They say the beacon lighters are heroes," he said, his voice high with excitement, guiding the Emperor's ships through the darkness. Sacred work. Another recruit, older, maybe 25, with the scarred hands of a factory worker, laughed bitterly. Sacred work that pays triple rations. You ever wonder why? Peter's face fell. The scarred man, he never told us his name, shook his head. The Imperium doesn't pay triple for easy work. Remember that. The elevator shuddered and groaned, climbing past levels I'd never imagined existed. Through the gaps in the elevator cage, I caught glimpses of the upper hive. Cleaner corridors, better lighting, fewer people. At the 2000th level, I saw actual plants growing in hydroponics bays, real green living things, not the gray-brown fungi we ate in the lower hives. At the 3000th level, the elevator passed through the nobility districts, where the hive's aristocracy lived in luxury I couldn't comprehend. I glimpsed through a transparent section of wall a space easily 50 meters across, decorated with fabrics and colors I didn't have names for. A single room larger than my entire hab block. Peter pressed his face to the elevator cage, staring. "That's what we're protecting," he whispered. "The Emperor's chosen. The blessed." I didn't say what I thought. That those blessed aristocrats had probably never missed a meal in their lives, had never watched someone die from preventable illness, had never understood that for billions of us, the Emperor's protection was just words on propaganda posters. At 3,500 meters, we passed through the cloud line. The industrial smog that choked the lower hive gave way to nothing. Just thin air and killing cold. I could see through the elevator cage now, see the impossible drop below us, see the curved horizon of Thessian 4 stretching away in all directions. And above us, rising another 500 meters, I saw the apex. The Hive-Spire narrowed to a point like a cathedral spire, and extending from it at various heights were platforms. Small structures jutting out into empty air like the fingers of a drowning man. On each platform, I could see the beacons, massive braziers 10 meters across, burning with chemical fire that cast light visible for hundreds of kilometers. Even from this distance, even through the elevator cage, I could smell them, a scent like burning copper and rotting flowers and something else, something organic and wrong. The scarred man was right. The Imperium didn't pay triple rations for easy work. The elevator shuddered to a halt at 3,847 meters. I remember the number because it was painted in fading white numerals on the platform designation. Apex 7, 3,847 meters. The doors opened and the cold hit us like a physical blow. My lungs seized, my eyes watered instantly, and my skin prickled with sudden goose flesh. But worse than the cold was the smell. That chemical stench I'd detected from hundreds of meters below was overwhelming here, a physical presence that coated the inside of my nose and throat like oil. A man was waiting for us. He wore heavy rubberized protective gear, thick suits that covered every centimeter of skin, and a mask that covered the entire lower half of his face. Not a respirator you could remove, but something bolted directly into the jaw, tubes running down into a tank on his back. His eyes were the only visible part of him, and they were yellow. Not naturally, but stained by chemical exposure. The whites turned the color of old parchment. When he spoke, his voice came through a Vox grill in the mask, mechanical and distorted. "Welcome to Beacon Station, Apex 7. I am Overseer Gren. You will address me as Overseer. You will obey all instructions immediately and without question. You will perform your duties until your contract is complete or until you are dead. Those are your only two outcomes. Do you understand?" We all nodded, too shocked by the cold and the smell and the casual mention of death to do anything else. "Good." Gren gestured to the platform extending from the Hive-Spire. It was perhaps 30 meters long and 15 wide, constructed of metal grating that allowed wind to howl through from below. At the far end sat the beacon, a massive brazier fed by pipes running back into the hive's interior, burning with chemical fire that was simultaneously brilliant and nauseating to look at. The flames were the wrong colors, greens and purples and blues that shouldn't exist in nature. and tending the beacon was another figure in protective gear, moving with the slow, deliberate motions of someone fighting exhaustion or pain or both. "Your duties are simple," Gren continued. "The beacon must burn continuously. The chemicals are fed automatically, but the igniters must be maintained manually. The heat degrades them rapidly. You will replace igniters every 2 hours. You will clean the primary combustion chamber every 6 hours. You will perform full maintenance every 72 hours. You will do this in 6-hour shifts, rotating with the other crews." "The protective gear," Pater started. "Provides minimal protection," Gren interrupted. "The chemicals are necessary for the beacon's function. They are also intensely corrosive. Skin exposure will cause immediate damage. Respiratory exposure will cause permanent lung scarring. Ocular exposure will cause blindness. The masks will be bolted to your jaws to prevent accidental removal. The suits will slow the damage, not prevent it." The scarred man spoke up. "How long do beacon lighters usually last?" Gren's yellow eyes fixed on him. "The contract is 5 years. 15% make it to contract completion. Most last between 8 and 18 months. The record is 7 years, held by a man named Corvus, who refused to die even after he'd lost most of his epidermis. He finally fell off the platform during a maintenance cycle. We never found the body." 15%. I felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Your families will be compensated regardless of how you die," Gren added, as if that made it better. "Triple rations, medical priority, improved housing. The administratum honors its contracts. You signed knowing the risks." But I hadn't known. None of us had known. The recruitment posters had shown proud workers and bright lights, not chemical burns and 15% survival rates. "First shift begins in 30 minutes, Gren said. "Follow me." The preparation chamber was a small enclosed space built into the side of the Hive-Spire, barely large enough for all 12 of us to stand. It smelled like chemicals and fear sweat and the distinctive copper and rot scent of the beacon. Gren directed us to stand in a line while 2 other masked figures, workers so covered in protective gear I couldn't tell if they were supervisors or beacon lighters who'd somehow survived, approached with equipment. "The mask fitting is permanent," Gren explained. "Do not resist. Resistance results in improper seal, which results in rapid respiratory failure, which results in drowning in your own dissolving lung tissue. Stay still." I watched in horror as they approached Peter first. One held a mask, a heavy rubberized thing with tubes and filters and a Vox grill, while the other held what looked like a bolt gun used in construction. They pressed the mask against Peter's face. He whimpered, his eyes wide with fear, but he held still. The mask covered from his nose to below his chin, sealing against his skin. Then came the bolts. The sound was horrific, pneumatic cracks as the bolts punched through the mask's flanges and into Peter's jawbone. 4 bolts, 1 at each corner. Blood ran down his neck, soaking into his collar. His scream was muffled by the mask, coming out as a distorted mechanical wail through the Vox grill. They moved to the next recruit. Same process, same sounds, same blood. I wanted to run. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to flee back to the elevator, to take my chances in the lower hive rather than endure this. But I thought of Alexi's cough, of my father's grey-stained fingers, of the promise of triple rations and medical care. "Your family will eat," Proctor Vane had said. Remember that when you're screaming. Then they were in front of me. Open your mouth, one of the masked workers said. We need to fit the internal tubes. I obeyed. They shoved something cold and rigid past my teeth. A tube that went down my throat, making me gag violently. Another tube up through my nasal passage. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stand there choking while they worked. Then the mask pressed against my face. The seal was tight, cutting off all air except what came through the tubes. I felt the bolt gun press against my jaw, felt the moment of pressure. The pain was extraordinary, white-hot agony as metal punched through skin and muscle and bone. I tried to scream, but the tubes prevented it, turning my agony into a strangled, gurgling sound. 4 times. 4 separate points of agony in my jaw. Then it was done. The tubes were connected to a tank they strapped to my back. Air flowed, cold and chemical tasting, but air nonetheless. The pain in my jaw settled into a throbbing ache that matched my heartbeat. Through the mask, everything sounded different. My own breathing was amplified. The world came to me through filters, slightly delayed, slightly distorted. You'll adjust, Gren said, his voice now recognizable as coming from the same kind of Vox grill. Or you won't. Either way, the work continues. They issued us the protective suits next, heavy rubberized materials that covered every centimeter of skin, sealed at the wrists and ankles and neck. They were hot and uncomfortable and smelled like chemicals and old sweat. The previous wearer's sweat, I realized. These suits had been worn before by beacon lighters who no longer needed them. Gloves came last, thick and clumsy, making fine motor control nearly impossible. You'll lose dexterity, Gren explained. The chemicals degrade the glove material. You'll need new gloves every 3 to 4 days. When you feel them starting to split, report immediately. If chemical makes contact with your skin. He held up his own hand, pulling back the glove to reveal what lay beneath. I wish I could forget what I saw. His hand was no longer recognizably human. The skin had been eaten away in patches, revealing muscle and tendon beneath. The remaining skin was discolored, mottled green and purple, covered in weeping sores that never healed. This is 6 months of exposure, Gren said flatly. I'm one of the lucky ones. I still have full function. Now, to the beacon. We walked out onto the platform single file, gripping the safety rails because the wind at this height was strong enough to knock a man off his feet. Below us was 3 kilometers of empty air, then the poisonous cloud line, then another kilometer to the Hive's lower levels. The beacon dominated everything. Up close, it was monstrous, a brazier 10 meters across, burning with chemical fire that hurt to look at, even through the protective goggles built into our masks. The heat was intense despite the freezing wind, and the smell. The smell penetrated even through the mask's filters, a nausea-inducing combination of burning chemicals and something that reminded me horrifically of burning flesh. The figure I'd seen earlier tending the beacon turned as we approached. Through the protective gear, I couldn't see any details, but the way they moved spoke of pain and exhaustion. This is Leiter Voss, Gren said. He'll demonstrate the igniter replacement procedure. Watch carefully. You'll be doing this 6 times per shift, every shift, until you die or your contract ends. Voss moved to a panel on the side of the beacon and opened it. Inside, I could see the mechanism, a complex array of pipes and combustion chambers, and, at the heart of it, a series of electrodes that provided the spark to ignite the chemical flow. The electrodes were glowing white-hot, visibly degrading from the heat and chemical exposure. Voss reached in, directly into the heat, despite the protective gloves, and grasped one of the electrodes. Even through my mask, I could hear his breathing change, becoming rapid and pained. He pulled the electrode free. It was the size of a man's forearm, still glowing, and dropped it onto the platform where it clattered and rolled, leaving scorch marks. Then he reached to a bin attached to the beacon and retrieved a new electrode. This involved reaching even deeper into the mechanism, exposing more of his arm to the heat. His breathing was definitely pained now, coming in sharp gasps through the Vox grill. He seated the new electrode, locked it in place, and withdrew his arm. The entire procedure had taken perhaps 90 seconds. "Simple enough?" Gren asked. "Simple. 90 seconds of exposure to heating chemicals, 6 times per shift, 4 shifts per day if we were on full rotation, every day for 5 years. You," Gren pointed at me, "your turn." My hands were shaking as I approached the beacon. The heat was overwhelming. Even through the protective suit, I could feel my skin prickling and sweating. I opened the panel and looked inside at the glowing electrodes. I reached in. The heat was immediate and overwhelming. Even through the thick gloves, it felt like plunging my hand into an open flame. My fingers fumbled for the electrode, clumsy in the heavy gloves, while the chemical fumes rising from the combustion chamber made my eyes water even behind the protective goggles. I grasped the electrode. The heat conducted through the glove material, and I felt my palm begin to blister. I pulled, but it was locked in place, held by a mechanism I couldn't see clearly through the shimmer of heat distortion. "Turn it counterclockwise first," Gren said, his voice flat and uninflected. "Then pull." I twisted. The electrode resisted, then gave suddenly, coming free in my hand. I yanked my arm back, gasping with relief, and dropped the glowing metal onto the platform. "Faster next time," Gren said. "You'll do this 1,000 times. Eventually you'll do it in under 60 seconds. Or your hands will be too damaged to function, and you'll fall off the platform, reaching too far in to compensate for lost dexterity." I grabbed the new electrode from the bin. It was cold, at least, not yet exposed to the beacon's interior, and reached back in. This time I knew the procedure. Seat it, turn clockwise, ensure the lock engaged. My arm was screaming by the time I withdrew it, the skin underneath the suit feeling raw and cooked. "Adequate," Gren said. "You'll all practice until you can do it blind and half-conscious. Because that's what you'll be, blind from chemical exposure, half-conscious from exhaustion and pain. The beacon doesn't care about your condition. It burns continuously, or ships crash into the hive trying to land, killing thousands. Your suffering prevents their deaths. Remember that when you're screaming." He gestured to the rest of the platform. 6 igniter stations per beacon. You work in pairs. 1 replaces, 1 monitors. If your partner falls or collapses, you continue the work, then report to me. We'll send someone to retrieve the body if possible. 6-hour shifts. First shift is 0600 to 1200. Second is 1200 to 1800. Third is 1800 to 0000. Fourth is 0000 to 0600. You'll rotate through all shifts on a 4-day cycle. When do we sleep? The scarred man asked. Between shifts, 6 hours work, 6 hours rest. Except when you're assigned to deep maintenance, which takes 12 hours and occurs every 72 hours. During maintenance cycles, you'll work 18-hour shifts with 3-hour rest periods. I did the mathematics in my head. 6 hours work, 6 hours rest, but every third day an 18-hour shift. That meant sleep deprivation would be constant. And all of this while exposed to chemicals that ate through flesh. 15% survival rate. Your quarters are adjacent to the preparation chamber, Gren continued. Bunks, rations, basic medical supplies. The Medicae station is on platform Apex 3, 1 kilometer below us. If you can still walk, you can reach it. If you can't walk, you die here. What about emergency evacuation? Peter asked, his voice distorted and mechanical through his new mask. Gren laughed. A horrible sound through the Vox grill, like metal scraping metal. Emergency evacuation to where? We're 3 kilometers above the cloud line. The only way down is the elevator, which takes 6 hours. If there's an emergency requiring evacuation, you'll be dead long before the elevator arrives. No. You work, or you die working. Those are your options. He checked a chronometer bolted to his wrist. 0600 hours. First shift begins now. Pairs assigned. Kale and Voss, Station 1. Peter and Jorn, Station 2. I barely heard the rest. I was paired with Voss, the man who'd been here long enough to make the procedure look routine. We moved to Station 1, the westernmost igniter panel, and Voss opened the monitoring display. Numbers scrolled across a small PIC screen. Chemical flow rates, combustion temperatures, igniter degradation percentages. It meant nothing to me, but Voss pointed to a specific reading. When this hits 85% degradation, we replace, he explained through his Vox grill. Usually takes 90 to 120 minutes. Watch the numbers. When you're too blind to see them clearly, you count time instead. 2 hours, replace. 2 hours, replace. Let the rhythm become automatic. How long have you been here? I asked. 14 months. 14 months. He'd survived almost twice the average. How? I don't know. His voice was hollow. I should have died at month 8 like most do, but I kept waking up, kept working. Sometimes I wish I'd fallen. Would have been faster. We stood there in silence, watching the numbers climb. The wind howled around us, carrying the chemical smell and a cold that penetrated even the protective suit. Above us, the beacon burned its impossible colors, casting everything in sickly green and purple light. Below us, 3 kilometers of nothing. At 0735, the degradation hit 85%. Voss nodded to me. Your turn. I'll monitor. I approached the panel, opened it, and reached inside. This time I knew what to expect. The overwhelming heat, the fumbling with thick gloves, the feeling of skin cooking beneath the protective layers. I completed the procedure in 75 seconds. Better, Voss said. You'll get faster, or you won't, and you'll die. Most don't make it past the first month. Why? I pulled my arm back, cradling it against my chest. Even through the suit, I could feel blisters forming. Why do they tell us it's 5 years if most die in 8 months? Because the administratum keeps records of contract length, not survival rates. On paper, everyone signs for 5 years. The 15% who make it to completion earn their freedom and family compensation. The rest. He gestured vaguely at the empty air around us. The rest earn their families triple rations for however long they last. 8 months of triple rations is better than nothing. That's monstrous. That's the Imperium. Voss turned back to the monitoring screen. The aristocrats in their spires need ships guided in safely. The ships carry luxuries, weapons, materials for the upper hives. Your suffering is a rounding error in the administratum's calculations. One more body burning so that gold and silk and wine can reach the nobility on schedule. I thought about the room I'd glimpsed during the ascent. 50 meters of space for one aristocrat, decorated in colors I couldn't name. And here I was, burning alive slowly, so their ships wouldn't crash. They told us the Emperor protects. Peter's voice came from Station 2, small and frightened. They lied, Voss said flatly. The Emperor's been a corpse for 10,000 years. He doesn't protect anything. He's just a symbol they use to make you obedient. The real gods of the Imperium are necessity and cruelty, and we're sacrifices to both. At 0951, we replaced the igniter again. At 1147, a third time. By noon, when our shift ended, my arms felt like I'd plunged them repeatedly into fire, which, essentially, I had. The first week was pain. Just pain, constant and unrelenting. The chemicals penetrated the protective suit within 48 hours. I first noticed it on the third day, when I removed my gloves during a rest period and saw that the skin on my palms had begun to discolor. Not burns, but something else. The flesh had taken on a faint greenish tinge, and when I touched it, it felt wrong, too smooth, too thin, like the top layer of skin had been partially dissolved and was beginning to separate from the layers beneath. The Medici on Platform Apex 3 told me this was normal. Normal in the sense that it happened to all beacon lighters. The chemicals. He listed names I didn't understand. Compounds with Gothic designations like Phosphex 7 and Luminen-grade corrosive were designed to produce the specific spectrum of light needed for ship guidance. They were not designed with human tolerance in mind. "Apply this salve twice daily," he said, handing me a tin of gray paste that smelled like spoiled fat. "It won't stop the degradation, but it will slow it." Maybe. Everybody reacts differently to the chemical exposure. Some men's skin sloughs off in sheets within weeks. Others develop a kind of toughening, scar tissue that's more resistant. There's no way to predict which you'll be. I applied the salve. It burned when it contacted the discolored skin, but it was a different kind of burning than the beacon. This was almost cleansing, medicinal. I wrapped my hands in clean bandages and returned to my bunk. Peter was there, lying on his bunk and staring at the ceiling. When he saw me, he held up his own hands. The discoloration had spread further on him. His entire palms and the first inch of his wrists were that sickly green color. "It's eating through me," he whispered through his mask. "I can feel it, like acid in my blood." The Medici said it's normal. "Nothing about this is normal." His voice rose to a shout, distorted through the Vox grill into something inhuman. "We're being poisoned to death. We're human candles burning to light the way for people who'll never know our names. Our families. We'll get triple rations soaked in our blood." He sat up, and I saw tears running down the visible portion of his face above the mask. "I don't want to die, Davos. I'm 18 years old, and I'm going to die in this poisoned hell, and for what? So some fat aristocrat's wine shipment arrives on schedule." I had no answer for him, because he was right. That night, I couldn't sleep. The pain in my hands was too intense, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw the beacon's impossible colors. The chemicals had already begun to affect my vision. When I looked at white surfaces, I saw faint traces of green and purple. After images that wouldn't fade, I lay in my bunk, listening to the sound of 11 other men breathing through their masks, mechanical, rhythmic, like the breath of machines instead of humans. And I realized that's what we were becoming. Components, tools, human mechanisms in service to the beacon's eternal burning. On day 5, during the deep maintenance cycle, I saw what the chemicals could really do. Deep maintenance meant disassembling the beacon's internal mechanisms, cleaning the combustion chambers of built-up residue, and replacing degraded components. It required crawling inside the beacon itself, a space barely large enough for a man's body, superheated and choked with chemical fumes so thick they were visible as colored mist. Voss and I entered together. The space was nightmarish. Metal walls crusted with chemical deposits that had hardened into sharp crystalline formations, pipes dripping with corrosive fluids, and heat so intense that my protective suit began to soften within minutes of exposure. "Respirator check," Voss said, his voice crackling through the vox. "If your tubes fail in here, you'll be dead before you can crawl back out. Your lungs will dissolve." I checked the tubes connecting my mask to the tank on my back. They seemed intact, but I could smell the chemicals anyway, somehow penetrating the seals, a taste like copper and flowers and rotting meat. We worked for 6 hours inside the beacon's guts, scraping away residue with metal tools that grew too hot to hold, replacing crystallized filters, resealing joints that had corroded through. By the end, my entire body felt like one massive blister. When I crawled back out into the freezing wind, it was almost a relief. Almost. Because when I removed my suit back in the preparation chamber, I saw what had happened to my skin. The discoloration had spread. Not just my hands now, but my forearms, my chest, my shoulders. Anywhere the suit had pressed tight against flesh, the chemicals had penetrated, staining my skin that nauseating green-purple color. And in some places, my right forearm especially, the skin had begun to peel. Not like a sunburn, not like any natural process. The skin was separating in translucent sheets, like wet paper sloughing off a surface. Underneath was raw pink flesh, weeping clear fluid that burned when it contacted air. I went to the Medici again. He barely looked at me before handing me more salve and a roll of bandages. "Week 1 degradation," he said, as if reading from a manual. "Apply salve, wrap exposed areas, continue duty." It hurts. It will hurt more. Pain management is not cost-effective for beacon lighters. You signed the contract. Continue your duty. I wanted to scream at him, to demand real treatment, to refuse to return to the beacon. But I thought of Alexei, of the medical care he was receiving, of my father eating better rations than he'd had in decades. I thought of Proctor Vane's words. "Your family will eat. Remember that when you're screaming." So I wrapped the bandages around my peeling skin, pulled the protective suit back on over the wounds, and returned to my shift. Peter didn't. When we mustered for the 1800 shift, he was missing. Gren sent 2 men to the quarters, and they found him in his bunk, staring at the wall, unresponsive. Chemical shock, Gren diagnosed without sympathy. Happens to the weak ones. Drag him to the Medici. If he recovers, he returns to duty, If not, document the death and prepare notification for his family. They dragged Peter away. I never saw him again. Later, I heard he'd died in the Medici station, his mind simply gone. Broken by the realization of what he'd become, what he was becoming. The scarred man, I learned his name was Jorn, took Peter's place at Station 2. He worked with a grim efficiency, never complaining, never speaking unless necessary. During a rest period, I asked him how he managed. "I've already died once," he said, showing me his scarred hands. "Factory accident 3 years ago, caught in the presses. They pulled me out and put me back together, and I realized something. I'm already dead. This?" He gestured at the beacon, at our peeling skin, at the whole poisoned nightmare. "This is just the Imperium finishing what it started. I'm not afraid of dying because I'm already a ghost." His philosophy didn't comfort me. I was 19 years old, and I was still terrified of death, but I understood the appeal. If you accepted you were already dead, maybe the horror became bearable. Maybe. By month 3, the physical changes had become severe enough that I barely recognized myself. My skin was mostly gone from my hands and forearms. What remained was a patchwork of scar tissue and raw flesh, constantly weeping that clear, burning fluid. The salve didn't help anymore. My body had adapted to it, or the chemical exposure had overwhelmed its minimal protective properties. I'd lost 15 kilograms. The triple rations we were fed couldn't compensate for the metabolic stress of constant chemical exposure and physical trauma. My body was consuming itself, burning muscle to keep vital organs functioning. My eyes had yellowed like grens, the whites stained permanently by chemical fumes. My vision had deteriorated. Everything was slightly blurred now, and I saw halos of green and purple light around every bright object. The Medicis said this was acceptable degradation and issued me higher prescription goggles. But the physical changes weren't the worst part. The worst part was what was happening inside my skull. I'd started losing memories. Not all at once, not obviously, just gaps. Small ones at first. I'd try to remember what Alexei looked like and find that I couldn't quite picture his face. The details were fuzzy, indistinct. I remembered he was my brother. Remembered he was 16. Remembered he had a cough. But his face? Gone. Then I lost the memory of my HAB unit's layout. I could remember it was 4.2 meters by 3.8 meters, but I couldn't remember where the bunks had been, where we'd kept our few possessions. The spatial memory was just absent. The book of poetry my father had given me. I couldn't remember what it looked like. The weight of it, the smell, those details remained. But I couldn't remember the color of the cover. Couldn't recall a single line of verse from its pages. The Medicare explained it clinically. The chemicals affect neural tissue, memory formation and retrieval are compromised. The damage is progressive and irreversible. You may retain functional capacity for work-related tasks while losing personal memories entirely. This is normal for beacon lighters past month 2. Normal, there was that word again. As if systematic destruction of human consciousness was an acceptable workplace hazard. Can it be stopped? No. The chemical exposure is constant. The degradation will continue until critical brain functions fail, at which point you'll die. Or until you lose motor control and fall from the platform, or until you simply forget to breathe. How long? He consulted a data slate. based on your degradation rate. 6 to 9 months before significant cognitive impairment. 12 to 18 months before total failure. I left the Medicaid station and stood on the platform, staring down at the 3-kilometer drop. It would be so easy. 1 step, 3 seconds of falling, then nothing. But I thought of my family, though I was starting to lose the details of what they looked like. And I stayed. The work had become automatic by this point. My body knew the rhythms even when my mind drifted. Every 2 hours, replace the igniter. Every 6 hours, clean the combustion chamber. Every 72 hours, deep maintenance. The routine was carved into my muscle memory, deeper than any personal recollection. I could perform an igniter replacement while thinking about nothing at all. My hands would reach into the beacon's heat. My fingers would manipulate the mechanisms, and my conscious mind would be somewhere else entirely. Or nowhere. Sometimes I'd complete a replacement cycle and have no memory of having done it, only the fresh burns on my arms to prove it had happened. The other lighters were changing too. Of the original 12, 8 remained. Pater was dead. 3 others had fallen or jumped or simply walked off the platform one day and never returned. Bjorn was still there, grim and mechanical, working with the efficiency of a man who felt nothing. Voss was there, 14 months now, becoming 17, becoming 20. He barely spoke anymore, communication reduced to essential technical instructions. And there were new arrivals, fresh recruits who still had skin that wasn't green-purple, who still remember their families clearly, who still believe the lies about honor and duty. I wanted to warn them, wanted to grab them and scream the truth, that they were signing up for slow dissolution, that the Emperor's protection was propaganda, that they would lose everything they were piece by piece until nothing human remained. But I didn't, because they'd signed the contracts, and their families needed the rations, and the beacon needed tenders, and my warning would change nothing. The Imperium's machine would grind them up regardless. One of the new recruits was a boy named Carol, 17 years old, thin and nervous. He'd been assigned to Station 1 with me after Voss was moved to supervisory duties, a promotion that meant he spent more time in the preparation chamber and less time exposed to direct chemical contact, a reward for surviving long enough to be useful as a trainer. Carol reminded me of how I'd been. Scared but hopeful, believing the lies, thinking he could endure anything for his family. During his first week, he asked me questions constantly. How long had I been here? Did it get easier? When would his hands stop hurting? I answered honestly. 7 months. No, never. But Overseer Gren said, Gren is a liar, or deluded, or both. There is no getting used to this. There's only the slow realization that you're dying, followed by the slower process of actually dying. He stared at me, and I saw my own horror reflected in his eyes. Then why do you stay? Because my family eats. Because I signed a contract. Because there's nowhere to go but down, and down is 3 kilometers of empty air. I paused. And because I've already lost too much of myself to quit now. I don't even remember what I'm trying to protect anymore. Just that I have to. That was the worst part. I knew I had a father and a brother. I knew their names, Joran and Alexei, but I couldn't remember their faces. Couldn't recall specific conversations. Couldn't access the emotional connections that should have been there. The knowledge was abstract, clinical. I was protecting people I no longer actually remembered. By month 4, I'd lost more. The memory of my 19th birthday was gone. My childhood was a blur of generic images, hab blocks and corridors, but nothing specific, nothing personal. I couldn't remember my first day at work, couldn't remember what I'd done in my free time, couldn't remember ever having been anything other than a beacon lighter. My identity was being erased, overwritten by the endless routine of the beacon. Replace igniter, clean chamber, maintain systems, sleep, wake, repeat. I started to lose track of time. Days blended together, each one identical to the last, marked only by shift changes and maintenance cycles. I couldn't remember what month it was without checking the chronometer. Couldn't remember how long I'd been here without consulting my own records. I was becoming a function, a process, a thing that performed beacon maintenance without the inconvenience of selfhood. The only thing that kept me tethered to humanity was the pain. The pain remained constant, undeniable, proof that I still existed in some form. My hands hurt, my arms hurt, my chest where the chemicals had eaten through to the bone hurt. Therefore, I was still real. Carol lasted 3 weeks before he tried to remove his mask. We found him during a shift change, clawing at the bolts in his jaw, blood streaming down his neck, screaming through the Vox grill about needing to breathe clean air, needing to taste something other than chemicals. It took 3 of us to restrain him. Gren had him sedated and dragged to the Medici, where they bolted additional restraints to his mask to prevent removal attempts. He returned to duty 2 days later. He didn't speak anymore. Just worked, mechanical and empty. Another function in service to the beacon. I wondered if I looked like that to the newer recruits. A walking corpse, human in shape only, going through motions without consciousness behind them. Probably. Month 6 was when I became what I'd feared. Gren died. His body finally gave out during a maintenance cycle, something vital dissolving beyond the point where augmetics and medication could sustain it. They found him slumped in the preparation chamber, yellow eyes staring at nothing, still breathing through his mask but otherwise lifeless. They promoted me to overseer. I was given Gren's quarters, slightly larger than the standard bunks, with a small desk and a data slate containing operational procedures. I was given his chronometer, his advanced protective gear, his responsibility for maintaining the beacon's operation and managing the lighter crews. I'd survived 6 months, which apparently made me senior enough for leadership. And with leadership came complicity. It was my job now to assign shifts, to approve medical leave, to document deaths, to train new recruits. It was my job to fit masks to fresh faces, to hold them still while bolts punched through their jaws, to listen to their screams and tell them it was necessary. It was my job to lie to them. The Imperium requires your service, I'd say, repeating the phrases I'd been told. Your sacrifice protects thousands. Honor lies in duty. Empty words, propaganda, lies designed to make them obedient, to make them accept their dissolution as noble instead of tragic. I'd become the thing I'd hated, a functionary in the machine that ground humans into component parts. The first time I fitted a mask to a new recruit, a boy named Sev, 18 years old, reminding me painfully of how I'd been. I wanted to tell him the truth. Wanted to say, run. Break your contract. Accept the punishment for desertion. Accept starvation in the lower hives. Accept anything except this. But I didn't. I pressed the mask against his face and fired the bolts. and I watched his blood run down his neck, and I said nothing. Because the beacon required tenders, because ships needed guidance, because the system perpetuated regardless of individual suffering, because I'd forgotten how to be anything other than a component. I managed crews now. I tracked degradation rates. I predicted which lighters would fail, first based on chemical exposure patterns and psychological resilience factors. I maintained records that would be sent to the administratum, bloodless reports that reduced human tragedy to numbers and percentages. Beacon Station, Apex 7, Month 6. Operational Report. Current staff, 11 lighters, 1 overseer, casualties. This period, 4, 2 falls, 1 respiratory failure, 1 psychological collapse. Replacement, recruits. 4 beacon operational status. 99.7% uptime. Chemical consumption. Within acceptable parameters, notes, overseer transition successful. No operational disruptions. That was how they saw us. Operational parameters, acceptable losses. Numbers on a report that someone in the administratum would glance at for 3 seconds before filing away forever. I tried to be a better overseer than Gren had been. I issued pain medication when available. I approved medical leave more generously. I tried to create schedules that gave people adequate rest. But it didn't matter. The chemicals still dissolved flesh. The work still destroyed minds. The beacon still burned, consuming human life as fuel for its eternal light. I was managing the rate of destruction, not preventing it. One night, I think it was night, I'd long since lost the ability to distinguish without checking chronometers. I sat at Gren's desk and looked at my own hands. They were no longer recognizable as hands. The flesh had been eaten away entirely in places, exposing bone and tendon. The remaining tissue was a mottled green-black, hardened into something between scar tissue and leather. I felt nothing when I looked at them. No horror. No despair. Just clinical observation. These are the tools I use to perform maintenance. They function adequately despite degradation. I'd stopped thinking of them as my hands. They were just mechanisms attached to the body that housed whatever remained of my consciousness. I pulled up my records on the data slate. Davos Kyle, age 20, Beacon Lighter designation, BL-47, 6-month service. Degradation assessment, moderate to severe physical, significant cognitive impairment, psychological adaptation, functional. Psychological adaptation, functional. That was their term for what had happened to me. Not traumatized, not destroyed, not reduced to empty mechanism. Functional. I was still useful, therefore I was functioning adequately. I checked the records of my family's compensation. Triple rations, delivered monthly. Medical priority access. Alexei had received treatment for respiratory infection. Successful outcome. Improved HAB unit. They'd been relocated to the 1,200th level, above the worst of the pollution, with 6.3 meters by 4.9 meters of space. My dissolution had purchased that. My slow death had bought my brother clean air and my father more space and better food. Was it worth it? I didn't know. I couldn't remember them clearly enough to make that calculation anymore. I knew abstractly that I loved them, that I'd made this sacrifice for them, but the emotional connection was gone, lost somewhere in the chemical fog that had eaten through my neural tissue. I was protecting ghosts, serving abstractions, dying for people I could no longer recall clearly enough to miss. Voss found me there, staring at nothing. He'd been promoted to maintenance supervisor, managing the technical aspects while I handled personnel. We were the senior staff now, both of us having survived long enough to be valuable. "You look how I felt at month 6, he said, settling into a chair across from me. His voice through the Vox grill was flat, emotionless. "Like you've realized what you've become." "What have I become?" "A murderer. You fitted masks today. You'll fit more tomorrow. You're the Administratum's instrument for processing fresh meat into beacon fuel. Same as Gren was. Same as whoever comes after you will be. I'm keeping people alive. No. You're managing their rate of death, making it efficient, making sure the beacon stays operational while humans dissolve around it." He leaned forward, and his yellow eyes were empty behind the goggles. "We're not the victims anymore, Davos. We're the system. We're the machine that eats people, and we keep doing it because we've forgotten how to be anything else." He was right. I hated that he was right. "Do you ever think about jumping?" I asked. "Every day. But I'm too much of a coward, and too much of what I was is already gone. What would be jumping? This meat shell? The fragment of consciousness still trapped in it? Would that even be death or just stopping?" I had no answer. We sat in silence, two ghosts wearing flesh suits, discussing death with a detachment of men discussing shift schedules. The beacon burned outside. It would burn tomorrow. It would burn forever, fed by an endless supply of humans who signed contracts thinking they could endure anything for their families. And I would keep fitting masks, keep assigning shifts, keep writing reports that reduced human tragedy to operational parameters. Because the system required it. Because the beacon required tenders. Because I'd forgotten how to do anything else. Month 9 was when I stopped being Davos Kyle entirely. I realized it during a routine igniter replacement. I reached into the beacon's heat, something I'd done thousands of times and felt nothing. Not pain, not discomfort. Nothing. I pulled my arm back and examined it. The protective suit had burned through completely in several places. Underneath, the flesh was blackened and charred. Bone was visible through gaps in the tissue. I should have been screaming, should have been rushing to the medikey, should have been experiencing shock or horror or anything. Instead, I felt mild irritation that the suit had failed and would need replacement. The pain receptors were dead. Burned out or chemically destroyed, I didn't know which. The nerve endings that should have been sending agony signals were simply gone. I was operating a body that I could no longer feel. I reported to the medico. Protocol required documentation of suit failures. The medico examined my arm with clinical detachment. Complete nerve death in the right arm below the elbow. Left arm showing approximately 60% nerve function loss. Chest and abdominal wall approximately 40%. This is consistent with month 9 degradation patterns. Is there treatment? Treatment for what? The nerves are gone. They don't regenerate. You'll continue to lose sensation until all pain receptors are non-functional. Then I won't be able to feel injuries. Correct. You'll need to perform regular visual inspections to ensure you haven't sustained damage that would impair function. Catastrophic injuries that would normally be indicated by pain will go unnoticed until mechanical failure occurs. He was talking about my body the way a Mechanicus tech priest would talk about a malfunctioning servitor, and I was listening with the same detachment. How long until total loss of sensation? 3 to 6 months, perhaps longer. Your degradation rate has been slower than average. I left the Medici station and returned to duty. The lack of pain was almost liberating. I could reach into the beacon's heat without hesitation, could perform maintenance without the distraction of agony. I was becoming more efficient, more functional, more like a machine. The mental changes accelerated in parallel with the physical ones. I'd lost almost all personal memories now. I knew my name was Davos Kyle, but only because it was written on my records. I knew I'd had a family, knew I'd come from somewhere, but the specifics were completely absent. I remembered the beacon. I remembered procedures. I remembered shift schedules and maintenance protocols and chemical exposure thresholds. Everything related to function remained. Everything related to identity was gone. I'd tried to hold on to something, anything that connected me to who I'd been, but there was nothing left to hold. One day, month 9, day 17 according to the chronometer, I tried to remember my father's name. I knew I'd had a father. The records confirmed it. Joran Kale, recipient of compensation payments. But when I tried to remember him, tried to recall his face or his voice or any specific interaction, there was just emptiness. The data was there. The emotional connection was not. I was a collection of facts about a person who'd once existed, walking around in the dissolved remains of that person's body. The new recruits noticed they'd come to me with questions or complaints or desperate pleas for reassignment, and I'd respond with perfect efficiency and zero empathy. I'd calculate optimal solutions, issue appropriate orders, maintain operational effectiveness. But I wouldn't care. Couldn't care. The capacity for caring had been eaten away along with everything else. Sev, the boy I'd fitted a mask to in month 6, confronted me during a rest period. "You've changed," he said. His voice still had emotion in it, still had fear and pain and desperation. "When I arrived, you still seemed human. Now you're like Gren was, like a machine wearing skin." "Psychological adaptation," I said, echoing the administratum's terminology. "The cognitive changes necessary for long-term function in high-stress environments." "That's not adaptation, that's erasure. You're disappearing and you don't even care." "Caring is not required for function. The beacon requires maintenance regardless of the operator's emotional state." He recoiled from me, horror in his eyes. "What happened to you?" "Chemical exposure, neural degradation, memory loss, sensation loss, psychological restructuring. Standard progression for beacon lighters past month 6. You'll experience the same deterioration within 3 to 5 months. I don't want to become like you. Preference is irrelevant. The degradation is inevitable. You signed the contract. Your family receives compensation. The beacon continues to burn. That's all that matters." I watched him walk away, and I felt nothing. He was correct. I had disappeared. The person named Davos Kyle had been overwritten by the function he performed. I was a beacon lighter. That was my entire existence. Everything else was just obsolete data. Voss found me later that same day. He looked worse than I'd ever seen him. 22 months now, far beyond anyone's survival projection. His body was more scar tissue than flesh. His movements jerky and uncoordinated, as degraded nerves misfired random signals. "I'm dying," he said without preamble. I felt something rupture during the last maintenance cycle. Internal hemorrhaging, probably. I have maybe hours, maybe days. You should report to the Medici. For what? To be documented? To have them confirm I'm dying slightly faster than predicted? He laughed, a horrible mechanical sound through his Vox grill. No, I came to tell you something. A warning or a prophecy or just observation. Speak. You think you've lost everything. You think there's nothing left of Davos Kyle except function. But you're wrong. There's one thing left. He reached out with a ruined hand and tapped my chest. Consciousness. Awareness. The thing that knows it's been erased, and that's the cruelest part. I don't understand. You will. When your body finally fails, and it will, mine is just failing first, you'll discover that the chemicals don't just destroy flesh and memory. They do something else. Something the administratum doesn't include in its reports. His voice dropped to a whisper. They preserve. The consciousness trapped in the chemical-saturated tissue doesn't die when the body stops. It continues, trapped, aware. Forever. That's impossible. Is it? How many beacon lighters have fallen from the platform, Davos? Dozens. Hundreds. And where do they fall? Into the beacon's chemical runoff, pooling in the collection tanks 3 kilometers below. All that human tissue, saturated with chemicals, dissolving and mixing together. I felt something then, not quite emotion, but a recognition of significance. You're saying, I'm saying the consciousness persists in the chemical itself. Every beacon lighter who's ever died here, every fragment of awareness that was trapped in their dissolved flesh, still exists in the chemical slurry, and that slurry is pumped back up to feed the beacon. We don't just tend it, Davos. We become it. We burn forever, fueling the light that guides ships for people who'll never know we're screaming in the flames. He coughed, a wet, tearing sound. I'm going to fall soon. My body will dissolve in the tanks, and I'll still be there, still aware, still burning, just like everyone else who's ever served this Emperor-damned beacon. That's just fear, delirium from blood loss. Maybe, but you'll find out. When your time comes, you'll fall or fail or simply stop, and your consciousness will seep into the chemical, and you'll discover I was telling the truth. And then you'll burn forever, screaming light into the void. He turned and walked toward the platform edge. I should have stopped him. Should have called for help, should have restrained him, should have done something, but I didn't. Because function required allowing non-functional units to self-terminate. Because I'd forgotten how to care. Because he might be right, and stopping him would only delay the inevitable. Voss walked to the platform's edge, looked back at me once, and stepped off. I watched him fall. 22 months of suffering, dissolved flesh, and chemicals-saturated consciousness dropping 3 kilometers into the collection tanks below. Then I returned to the preparation chamber and filed a report. Maintenance Supervisor Voss, BL-12, terminated service via voluntary platform departure. Estimated survival, 22 months, 7 days. Replacement required. I felt nothing writing it. Nothing at all. So now you understand. Now you know how I got here. Standing 3 kilometers above the poison clouds, skin peeling off in translucent sheets, tending a beacon that burns with chemical fire that eat human souls. It's month 11 now. My body is barely functional. The flesh has been dissolved from 60% of my skeleton. I can see my own ribs through gaps in the disintegrated tissue. My hands are skeletal, bone and tendon and scraps of chemical-hardened leather that might have once been skin. I can't feel any of it. The pain is completely gone, replaced by nothing. I'm piloting a corpse through mechanical memory, performing functions that my body completes without conscious direction. And Voss was right. I can feel it happening. The chemicals have saturated my tissue so completely that the boundary between my flesh and the beacon's fuel has blurred. When I stand too close to the flames, I feel something that isn't sensation exactly, more like recognition. Like the fire knows me. Like part of me is already burning in it. The consciousness doesn't die. The chemicals preserve it, trap it, transform it into something that can exist as pattern without form, as awareness without body. I've started hearing them, the voices in the flame. Thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, every beacon lighter who's ever died on this platform, their dissolved consciousness burning eternal in the chemical fire. They scream. Not with sound, but with something deeper. A psychic agony broadcast through the beacon's light, invisible to the ships it guides, but felt by anyone with enough chemical saturation in their neural tissue to perceive it. Voss is in there. I hear his voice sometimes, calling my name, welcoming me to the eternal burning. Gren is there. Peter is there. All the others whose names I've forgotten are there, waiting for me. My body is failing rapidly now. The last medical examination estimated I have weeks, maybe days, before critical system failure. My lungs are barely functional. The tubes bolted into my mask do most of the breathing now, pumping air directly into tissue that's more chemical than organic. My heart is struggling. The muscle has been damaged by chemical exposure, beating irregularly, sometimes stopping for seconds at a time before starting again. I should be dead already. The only reason I'm not is that I've become so saturated with the beacon's chemicals that they're sustaining me directly. I'm not being kept alive by biology anymore. I'm being preserved by the same compounds that are destroying me. I'm becoming the beacon, or the beacon is becoming me. The distinction has ceased to matter. Yesterday, or what the chronometer labeled yesterday, time has lost all meaning. A new overseer arrived. My replacement. A man named Torin who'd survived 14 months on Platform Apex 3 before being promoted and transferred here. He has yellow eyes and damaged hands and that flat mechanical voice. That means his psychological adaptation is functionally complete. I transferred operational control to him. Gave him Gren's quarters, Gren's data slate, Gren's responsibility for managing the meat that feeds the beacon. "How long did you last?" he asked, examining my skeletal frame with clinical interest. 11 months, 17 days. That's above average. What's your secret? I wanted to laugh. Would have laughed if I still remembered how. There is no secret. The chemicals preserve you just long enough to make your suffering maximum. You think you're lasting because you're strong, but you're really lasting because your death has been optimized for efficiency. He nodded as if I'd confirmed something he'd suspected. When will you fall? Soon. Days, probably. Maybe hours. The body is ready to fail. Do you want medical intervention? Life extension? No, let it end. Understood. When you fall, I'll file the appropriate documentation. Your family will receive the final compensation payment. 11 months of triple rations. Not bad. 11 months of my dissolution reduced to not bad. That's what I'd become. That's what all of us become. Numbers in reports, compensation payments, acceptable losses in the Imperium's eternal machinery. I left him in the preparation chamber and walked back out to the platform. To Station 1. where I'd stood for 11 months, replacing igniters and cleaning combustion chambers and slowly dissolving into chemical residue. The beacon burned before me, green and purple and impossible blue, casting light that would guide ships through the atmospheric interference, help them land safely on platforms where aristocrats would receive their wine and silk and luxuries. All of it fueled by screaming consciousness, trapped in chemical fire. I reached out to perform one final igniter replacement, not because it needed it, but because the routine was all I had left. My skeletal hand reached into the heat, grasped the electrode, twisted it free, and I felt it, the beacon's invitation, the pull toward the flames that would consume what remained of my body and add my consciousness to the eternal burning. It would be so easy to lean forward, to let my body tumble into the brazier, to burn immediately instead of falling 3 kilometers to dissolve in the collection tanks. The result would be the same. Consciousness preserved in chemical fire, screaming light into the void forever, but at least it would be faster. I didn't fall forward into the beacon. Not yet. Because that same morning, 6 new recruits arrived on the elevator. Fresh meat for the grinder. Young men with intact skin and functioning nerves, and memories of families they still loved. I watched from the platform as Overseer Torin met them in the preparation chamber. Watched as he gave them the same speech Gren had given me. Essential services, compensation, honor through duty. Lies, all lies. But lies they needed to hear to accept what came next. He fitted their masks. I heard their screams through the vox distortion, heard the pneumatic crack of bolts punching through jawbones. 6 times. 6 new tools created for the beacon service. One of them, a boy who couldn't have been older than 17, tried to resist. He pulled away when they brought the mask close, shaking his head, saying he'd changed his mind. He wanted to go home. Torin didn't pause, didn't acknowledge the resistance. Just had 2 other lighters restrain him while the mask was fitted and bolted. The boy's screams didn't matter. His consent didn't matter. He'd signed the contract. His body belonged to the Imperium now. When it was done, Torin brought them out to the platform for initial training. They stumbled in the freezing wind, overwhelmed by the smell and the sight of the beacon and the sheer drop below them. The boy who'd resisted saw me standing at Station 1, saw my skeletal frame, my dissolved flesh, my yellow eyes staring from a face that was more skull than human. "What happened to you?" he whispered through his new mask, his voice mechanical and distorted. Chemical exposure, neural degradation, standard progression, I said, repeating the clinical terminology that had replaced human language in my mind. You'll experience the same deterioration, 3 to 8 months until severe impairment, 8 to 18 months until critical failure. No, they said 5 years. They said if we completed the contract, they lied. 15% survival rate to contract completion. You'll most likely die in the first year. Your family will receive compensation for however long you last. That's all that matters. He turned to Torin. I want to leave. I'm breaking my contract. I'll pay whatever penalty. Contract termination requires administratum approval, Torin said flatly. Processing time is 6 to 9 months. During processing, you remain on duty. By the time approval arrives, you'll be too damaged to leave. The system is designed to be inescapable. The boy started crying, his tears running down the visible part of his face, his shoulders shaking with sobs. "I don't want to die. I'm 17 years old. I don't want to die." None of us did. But we were going to die anyway. Ground up in the Imperium's machinery, our suffering transformed into light that guided ships for people who would never know our names. I turned away from him and performed an igniter replacement. My hands moved through the procedure automatically, without conscious thought, while behind me the boy sobbed and tore and explained duty and necessity, and all the other lies we used to make the horror bearable. The cycle continues. Fresh recruits arrive, get processed, work until they dissolve, fall or fail, get replaced by new recruits. The beacon burns continuously, fed by an endless supply of human suffering. And somewhere in the Administratum's towering archives, there are reports documenting it all. Bloodless numbers and operational parameters that reduce tragedy to statistics. Beacon Station, Apex 7. Perpetual operations, monthly casualties, 3 to 5 lighters. Monthly replacements, 3 to 5 recruits. Beacon uptime, 99.4% average. Chemical efficiency, within acceptable parameters. Cost-benefit analysis. Positive recommendation. Continue current operational model. That's what we are. A positive cost-benefit analysis. Acceptable losses in service to Imperial infrastructure. I watch the new recruits begin their first shift. Watch them fumble with the igniter procedures, crying out in pain through their Vox grills as the heat burned through their gloves. Watch them experience the first stages of the degradation that would ultimately consume them, and I felt nothing. No pity, no anger, no sadness. Just the hollow recognition that the pattern continues, that the system perpetuates regardless of individual suffering. That's what the beacon does. It doesn't just consume bodies. It consumes the capacity to care about the consumption. It turns witnesses into participants, victims into functionaries, humans into mechanisms. I'd become what I'd feared, what I'd hated. I was the system now, standing at the edge of the platform, performing my function until critical failure occurred. But unlike the new recruits, I knew what was coming. I knew what happened when the body finally stopped. I knew about the consciousness preserved in chemical fire, the eternal burning, the screaming light. Voss had warned me. And every day his warning became clearer as I felt the boundary between my flesh and the beacon's fuel blur further. I was already burning. I just hadn't fallen into the flames yet. What does this mean? What does it say about the Imperium that this is how it operates? I think about that question with the fragments of consciousness I have left. Not often. Thinking requires effort, and effort requires caring, and I've mostly lost the capacity for both. But sometimes, in the moments between shifts when my body is idle and my mind hasn't quite finished dissolving, I consider the implications. The Emperor protects. That's what they told us. The sacred mantra repeated in every imperial prayer, every propaganda broadcast, every recruitment speech. But look at me. Look at what I've become. Look at the 1,000 screaming voices trapped in the beacon's flames. Where was the protection? Where was the divine intervention? Where was the evidence that any god, any emperor, any cosmic force gave the smallest damn about our suffering? It never came, because it was never real. The emperor is a corpse rotting on a throne, kept barely alive by machinery and human sacrifice. He doesn't protect. He devours. The Imperium built in his name is a machine for transforming human life into utility. Rations, labor, light, death. We were taught that service was sacred, that suffering for the Imperium was nobility, that our pain purchased something meaningful, safety, order, humanity's survival. More lies. Our suffering purchased wine shipments for aristocrats. Our dissolution lit the way for luxury goods. Our screaming consciousness provided navigation assistance so the wealthy never experienced the inconvenience of delayed cargo. That's all. That's what we died for. Not humanity's survival, not the species' future, not any grand purpose, just the continued comfort of people who would never know our names, never acknowledge our existence, never consider for 1 second the cost of their convenience. The false gods of the Imperium aren't chaos entities or alien deceptions. They're necessity and efficiency and cost-benefit analysis. They're administratum reports that reduce human tragedy to acceptable parameters. They're systems designed to extract maximum utility from human suffering before discarding the used-up remains. And we perpetuate it, not because we're evil, but because we've been ground down to the point where perpetuation is the only thing we remember how to do. I fitted masks to new recruits because I'd forgotten how to refuse. I managed their degradation because I'd forgotten there was any alternative. I participated in the system because the system had erased everything in me that might have resisted. That's the genius of it. The Imperium doesn't need loyalty. It just needs time. Give it enough time with any human, subject them to enough degradation, and they'll become functionaries serving the very machine that destroyed them. We don't serve the Emperor. We serve entropy. We serve the slow, inevitable grinding down of complexity into utility, of humanity into fuel, of consciousness into light. And the cruelest part, the part Voss understood in his final moments, is that the awareness persists. The consciousness that knows it's been destroyed, that understands it's become complicit in its own obliteration, doesn't get the mercy of dying. It continues, trapped, burning, forever. Is there any escape, any hope, any possibility of breaking the cycle? I don't know. My degraded mind can't formulate answers to questions like that. But I suspect the answer is no. The system is too vast, too entrenched, too efficient at converting resistance into fuel. Individual rebellion accomplishes nothing. Voss jumped, and his consciousness joined the eternal burning. The boy who resisted got his mask fitted anyway, and now works his shifts like everyone else. I'm dissolving on schedule despite my awareness of the horror. The beacon burns regardless. The Imperium continues regardless. The suffering is eternal regardless. Maybe that's the real truth of the grimdark future. It's not that there's only war, it's that there's only function. Human experience has been reduced to utility calculation. Suffering has become operational parameter. Death has become acceptable loss. And we're all components in a machine so vast that our individual destruction doesn't even register as malfunction. Just normal operation. Just the beacon burning as designed. Just the Imperium processing another batch of humans into light. It's happening now. As I speak to you, I can feel my body entering critical failure. My heart is beating irregularly, stuttering, stopping, restarting with decreasing frequency. My lungs have ceased meaningful function. I'm sustained entirely by the mask's forced air pumping directly into dissolved tissue. My legs are failing. The muscles have degraded to the point where they can no longer support the skeletal frame. I'm collapsing slowly, the metal platform rushing up to meet me. I'm falling. Not off the platform. That would be too quick. I'm falling slowly, collapsing in stages, my body crumpling as each system fails in sequence. And I can feel the beacon's pull. The chemical fire calls to the chemical-saturated consciousness trapped in my dissolving flesh. It recognizes me, knows me, welcomes me home. The voices in the flames are louder now. Voss is there, his voice clear through the psychic screaming, "Come, burn, join us, become light. I don't want to." The fragment of humanity still remaining in my degraded neural tissue rebels against the idea of eternal burning, eternal consciousness trapped in fire. But wanting doesn't matter. The chemicals have made the transformation inevitable. When this body stops, seconds from now, minutes at most, the consciousness will seep into the chemical residue, be collected in the tanks below, be pumped back up to feed the beacon, and I'll burn, and I'll scream, and I'll be aware of every moment of it, forever. My last thought as a physically embodied being is this: remember my name, WH40K. Remember that I was human once, that I had a family I loved, that I signed a contract thinking I could endure anything for them. Remember that the Imperium did this to me. Not chaos, not aliens, not external enemies. The Imperium itself, the system humans built and humans maintain and humans perpetuate. Remember that when you see beacon lights guiding ships to landing, remember that each point of light is made of screaming consciousness, dissolved humanity, eternal suffering transformed into utility. Remember that the Emperor protects nothing, that prayers go unanswered, that the false gods are bureaucracy and necessity and the casual cruelty of systems that value function over existence. Remember that we're all going to burn. Some quickly, in combat or accident or sudden disaster. Some slowly, like me, processed through the Imperium's machinery until nothing human remains. But we all burn. My heart has stopped. The mask continues pumping air into lungs that can no longer absorb it. My consciousness is separating from the failed meat, dissolving into the chemical saturation that permeates every cell. I'm falling toward the beacon's flames. Not physically. My body has collapsed on the platform, will lie here until Tauren orders it thrown into the chemical tanks. But psychically, spiritually, whatever you want to call the part of me that knows itself, I'm falling into the fire. The voices surround me now. Thousands of them, all the beacon lighters who came before, all screaming welcome, all burning forever, all adding their light to the beacon that guides ships through the darkness. I can see them. Not with eyes. Those stopped functioning minutes ago. But with whatever perception remains in consciousness without form, I can see the pattern of them. The vast web of awareness trapped in chemical fire, each point of light a human soul ground up and transformed into utility. And I'm joining them. The fire embraces me, not with warmth. It's beyond temperature, beyond sensation. It embraces me with recognition, with the horrible welcome of inevitability, with the confirmation that Voss was right about everything. I am burning now. My consciousness is fuel for the beacon's eternal light. I can feel my awareness stretching, extending, becoming part of the pattern. I'm no longer WH40K, individual human. I'm becoming light, becoming signal, becoming navigation assistance for ships full of wine and silk and luxuries. And I'm screaming. All of us are screaming. The beacon's light is made of screams, psychic agony broadcast through every photon that leaves the flames. The ships can't hear it. The aristocrats can't perceive it, but it's there, woven into the light itself. Humanity's suffering transformed into utility. I can see the new recruits on the platform, the 17-year-old boy who didn't want to die. I try to warn him, try to tell him to run, to break his contract, to choose any fate except this one. But I have no voice. Only light, only burning, only the eternal function of guiding ships through darkness while screaming silently in the flames. The boy performs his first igniter replacement. His hands shake. His voice cries out in pain through the Vox grill. He doesn't know that in 6 months, 8 months, a year, he'll be here with me. His consciousness will join the pattern. He'll burn forever alongside thousands of others, eternal fuel for the beacon's eternal light. And the cycle will continue. Fresh recruits will arrive, get processed, dissolve, join the flames, forever. Because the Imperium requires it, because the beacon must burn, because human suffering is the Imperium's most renewable resource. I'm burning, and I'm aware of it, and I'll be aware of it forever. My name was Davos Kyle. I was 19 years old when I signed a contract to become a beacon lighter. I thought I could endure anything for my family. I thought the Emperor would protect those who served with faith and dedication. I was wrong about everything, and now I burn. Forever. The beacon continues. The light guides ships. The system perpetuates. And somewhere in the Administratum's archives, my final report reads, Beacon Lighter, BL-47, Kale, D. Critical failure, day 351. Cause, systemic degradation, chemical exposure, duration of service, 11 months, 19 days, contract completion, no, terminated 88% prior to completion. Family compensation, authorized, triple rations for duration, served replacement. Assigned, recruit BL-73, operational impact, negligible, beacon uptime maintained. Status, acceptable loss. Acceptable loss, that's what I am, what I was, what I'll be forever in the chemical fire that transforms human suffering into light. Remember my name. Remember what the Imperium does to its own. Remember that the beacon burns eternal, fueled by screaming consciousness, and that everyone who tends it eventually joins the flames. Remember, and when you see the light guiding ships through darkness, know that you're seeing human souls burning forever, in service to an empire that values function over existence. My name was Davos Kyle. I'm burning. I'm still burning. I'll always be burning. And the beacon continues. The beacon continues. The beacon continues.